Well, welcome everybody, and welcome back, and welcome back into our building and into our lives as intellectuals in a collective communal space. Of course, many of you have been teaching. Many of our students especially have been teaching in person, but it's really important for us also to get other aspects, other entities within CUNY and the Graduate Center back into the building, and so that we're in conversation, in each other's presence, that we're sort of bumping into each other, figuring out what our elevator speeches are, talking about our books, talking about our ideas, talking about our families, talking about who we are in relationship to our work, and thinking about the public and transformation and all the things that make us who we are. That is the Graduate Center as part of the City University of New York, a transforming presence. My name is Herman Bennett, for those of you who don't know me. I am the director of the Institute of Research on the African Diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean. And I'm honored to be following some very distinguished directors. Martin Ruck, who couldn't be here today, played a really significant role in the transition from Professor Robert Reedfar, the previous director, in maintaining our presence and maintaining the good work that we do. And I'll speak about that in a second. But he did that in partnership with Z. Dempster, who has played a significant role in maintaining our fellowship programs, our postdoctoral programs, and also a lot of significant content online. And so it is, my job is really made easy. I'm coming here to just pick up the reins of very accomplished scholars, very accomplished administrators. And so my job is really quite simple, right? It's just like to figure out how to get things up and going again with regard to the Institute of Research in the African Diaspora, and to figure out where we're at with regard to the work on African diaspora in relationship to New York, in relationship to CUNY and to the Graduate Center. That work is dynamic. It's dynamic in the sense that, as we all know, the work around race and racial formations is constantly subject to changes. And so there have been some really transformative changes that have happened around those kinds of issues in the last few years, not just simply in the context of the United States, but on a global scale. For those of you who work in Europe and who have been traveling in Europe, you know that for a fact, right? When these days walking in the streets in Paris, or walking the streets in Belgium, or for that matter in the streets of Köln and Berlin and London, right? Those places are transforming what we once knew as old Europe, or as what Donald Rumsfeld once referred to as old Europe. That moment is no longer there. And so the work that we do here, and the work that you do, and the work that we sort of engage with regard to our students, is helping make sense of that changing, transforming world at this particular moment. And so that's why we have to get back together to figure out like what kinds of conversations we are in need of, what kinds of research that needs to be demanded, that our times and our moments demand. But we also do other things too. And one of them at ERDAC is to sponsor fellowships. And that's probably the main reason why he wanted us to get together today. I wanted you just to remind you that one of the things that we do is to sponsor 3 annual postdoctoral fellowships, right? And today we have one of the postdoctoral fellows, Rebecca Paul, who's here. I just wanted to introduce you so that, you know, somebody who's in the building and who I will make introductions to individually, but also online and so on, so that most of you can actually spend some time getting to understand what her work is about and how her work contributes and engages and intersects with yours. You know that that's part of what my job is as a facilitator. We also have a dissertation fellowship and 7 ERDAC fellows and 2 digital fellowships. The ERDAC fellows are one of the most exciting things that I do in this building. That is, every Friday, I sit with some really brilliant young graduate students who are pushing at the frontiers, who are making me reel back on my heels to think about the fact that I need to be reading harder and spending more time reading their work and engaging with the things that they're engaged with. This past week, I listened to Horacio and Carlos just talk about, in really brilliant ways, different fields, art history and music, to sort of talk about the importance of the African diaspora in one place in the context of Peru, and another context in relationship to Mexico. And just fascinating. And there we sat for 2 hours, over 2 hours, thinking, engaging with each other about minutiae, about theory, about conceptualization, and it was exciting, it was riveting. And to me, that is what the ERDAC Fellows do. Every week, on more or less every week, we meet and they talk about what their work is about, their dissertation projects, to help them advance their scholarship. That's exciting, right? That's what we do here in the Graduate Center, is to support each other, to listen to each other, to engage each other, to push each other to think harder, to be better at what we can do and what we are doing. So on that note, I would like to also introduce those fellows very quickly. Could you just for a second, could Carlos, who's here, I'm looking at Carlos. Mia's not here, I don't think. And Kyle's not here, but Katya is also not here, but that's because they're teaching, right? Or they're actually writing. Behu, Jadel's not here, but Anna. So Carlos, you're taking all the there. Right, there she is. I see her. There's Michelle Yom, and Horacio. So Michelle, just stand up for a second too. All right. And so they are what keep us busy on Fridays, every Friday, and they keep us busy over the course of the year and what we do. When you leave, please take one of those. Many of you first and second and third and fourth year graduate students, take one of these with you to sort of hear what the descriptions of their projects are, so we don't have time, so we can get into the other part of the program today. But one of the things I want you to keep note of, December 21st is the competition, is the deadline for the next competition of the ERDAC Fellows, right? Please communicate the word. Even if you're not applying, communicate that word out there so that we have others who might be interested to be in conversation with us and with each other. And finally, I just wanted to, before I turn to introducing our Candace Chu and switch to a different hat, I want to take a second right now because many of you may have not met our Provost. And I would like to take a second here to introduce Provost Steve Everett, who's back here. Please stand up. I just want to take a second just to sort of thank you for being here and being among us, and for also just for what you're going to be doing for us as an institution, for the leadership that you're going to offer us, and the ways in which you're going to help curate a kind of promising future in terms of your leadership and that of our president. So I really am grateful that you're here today. So thank you. Candace Chu needs no introduction. Seriously. She is a professor in the PhD program in history. She is a core member of the Mellon Committee on the Seminar of Globalization and Social Change, a professor in American Studies, Critical Social Psych, and Liberal Studies. That means she's basically doing all the work in the building. Like everyone else that's here, like all the faculty and all the students. We all carry many hats. We carry many loads. She was, in 2017, she was the president of the American Studies Association, and she's the author, among other texts, The Difference Aesthetics Makes on the Humanities After Man, and then also Imagine Otherwise, on Asian Americanist Critique. But these are just sort of things that are easily picked off the website or CV. To actually know who Candace is requires you to be in this building and to be present in the context of our intellectual landscape. She's everywhere, and she does an incredible amount of work and with brilliance and grace, and always is pushing and supportive of students, faculty, staff. Her kindness and her intellectual brilliance that that combination that she brings to what she does is remarkable. And it's a real pleasure to always be in your presence. You're a really remarkable, remarkable colleague and friend. So, Candace?
Okay, now I really have to lower this. That was a beautiful introduction to my introduction. It's really wonderful to be with all of you. There are people in this room I haven't seen for years. Some I've never met before, but some I haven't seen for years, and so I feel I'm quite moved beyond that lovely introduction. I am Candace Chu. I am one of the very many who benefit from the work that IRIDAC does and has done for a long time. It is my especial privilege and honor and joy to be here for this inaugural event of this year, which is to say this occasion to renew and newly appreciate IRIDAC. It is also a distinct privilege, honor, and joy to introduce our speaker, the director of IRIDAC, Professor Herman Bennett, my friend and colleague, to you. I have for several years now opened occasions such as these by inviting us to remember deliberately all who have gone before, as well as those who are with us yet and still, simply all who make us possible. I mean to refer to ancestors, both familial and intellectual, as well as contemporaries, both known and unknown to us, who are our conditions of possibility. Everyone from those forcibly removed or made forcibly to labor as part of U.S. nation building, to those who make this building run and maintain the subways and streets we have traversed to get here, to those who taught and teach us and who are our intellectual predecessors, as well as everyone involved in IRIDAC, especially Z. Dempster. I ask us to remember in order to hold to mind and heart the presence and mattering of those who may be physically absent to us. I offer that invitation again as I begin my introduction of Professor Bennett, because it resonates with the work he has done. He is an historian of the African diaspora in its most expansive sense, which is to say, across his many articles, dozens upon dozens of lectures, and his 3 major monographs, he has brought forward heretofore or understudied aspects of African diasporic life hearkening to centuries past, and persistently insisting on the complexity of that life, of the subjects and communities comprising the vastness that is the African diaspora. That complexity, Professor Bennett has shown, too regularly erased in both academic and popular arenas, contests and contradicts the centralization of the slave as the penultimate figure of Blackness or the African diaspora. What happens, he writes, to our understanding of Black identity when its foundational trope, the slave, is no longer conceived of as a stable subject? How does our understanding of the Black present change when we configure complexity into the slave past? Across his work in his study of Afro-Mexican communities, his research into the mediating impact of Christianity and encounters between Portuguese and Spanish and a variety of African polities, Professor Bennett demonstrates that those understandings of Black identity and the Black present shifts toward what I would suggest is vitality. That is, as he shows us how the African diaspora, as exemplified by African-Mexican subjects, is a history comprised of enacted freedoms through which families were constituted, sex and marriage were understood, and morality was debated, the vitality of the African diaspora comes to the fore. Moreover, he shows us the potency of the African polities in their negotiations with Portuguese and Spanish before 1492, drawing attention to how dominant European histories have emphasized the inauguration of the slave trade and slavery in their renderings of European and African encounters, to the occlusion of such bilateral relations. How do such histories, such understandings of the emergence of the West transform in acknowledging, as his work compels us to do, the negotiations between African and European sovereignties in these early eras? Those who were made into the objects of the slave trade and slavery, as Bennett puts it, were historically subjects, clients, and vassals of African lords and elites whose own status fluctuated over time. To his question of what changes in light of this history of the life and livingness and complexity and contradiction and politics and policies of people and communities of African descent in the early modern eras, we might add, frankly, what doesn't change? to how we conceive of the current conjunctions emergence and sustenance, to the possibilities for change and the intellectual habits and scholarly questions to be asked and pursued around Blackness and African diasporic life, to our understanding of the West and Europe and modernity writ large, as well as to the immense heterogeneity the African diaspora as a term intends to capture. What Professor Bennett provides, in other words, is work that demonstrates that African diasporic, Latin American, and European history must be thought and studied together, that Blackness and African diasporic histories are complex in ways we have yet fully to understand, that the study of all of this is a study of the thick present and the political terms and concepts that are the received legacies we inhabit, as much as it is a grappling with the early modern. He is an historian of Christianity as much as the early modern era, a theorist of historiography as much as modernity, and is evinced in the meticulous manner in which he pays attention to rhetoric, to language, to tropes and images. He has some literary critical chops, too. It is, in short, a great good fortune to have this intellectual force at the helm of IRIDAC. Professor Herman L. Bennett is Distinguished Professor of History, Africana Studies, American Studies, and Global Early Modern Studies at the Graduate Center. Among his many publications are 3 excellent monographs: Africans in Colonial Mexico, Absolutism, Christianity, and Afro-Creole Consciousness, 1570 to 1640, Colonial Blackness, A History of Afro-Mexico, and most recently, African Kings and Black Slaves, Sovereignty and Dispossession in the Early Modern Atlantic. He is currently at work on Bones of the Dead, Blackness, Gender, and Historical Consciousness in Spanish America, while also working on a book-length project titled An Unacknowledged Brief History, Afro-Germans and the Afterlives of Fascism and Jim Crow, 1955 to 1989. Not surprisingly, he has received numerous awards and honors, including 2 NEH grants, a Mellon Fellowship in the Humanities, an ACLS Burkhardt Fellowship, and membership in the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. He was inducted into the Johns Hopkins Society of Scholars in 2016 and received the American Historical Association's Equity Award for excellence in recruiting and retaining underrepresented racial and ethnic groups into the historical profession. Professor Bennett was also an Obama Fellow at the Johannes Gutenberg Universität Mainz and is currently a Global Professorial Fellow at Queen Mary University of London. There is so much more, but I'll stop. You can actually speak. Today, Professor Bennett offers us in Ein Fremdesland, in A Strange Land, Sex, the Political, and Black Domesticity in Post-War Germany. Please join me in welcoming him.
You don't even recognize yourself when, Thank you so much, Candace. Thank all of you for being here. So I'm going to just sort of give you a glimpse of some new work that I've been struggling with. It's stuff that I've been working on for a very long time, but really haven't really made sense of the framing and my voice, and moreover the audience that I wish for this project to be a part of. It may be a part of many different conversations. The stakes are pretty clear for me, right? The stakes around this project are around questions about racial formation in Europe. I'm interested in thinking through and historicizing and thinking more carefully about the existential question of what it means to be Afro-German in the post-war period. And part of what you're going to hear today is a kind of story about background, right? Context, which to me is still a big part of the story, right? Getting to 55 to 89, that is a framing of Afro-Germans that's really in some ways in conversation with the Afro-American presence, is really where I want to go, but I still am trying to think about framing and context to get there. And so that's one way of thinking about the stakes, but also the other stakes are with regard to institutions and blackness, right? There's a way in which we in this age of thinking about abolition and thinking about carcerality and thinking about institutions and regulating black men mostly, what we have lost sight of is that the US military played a significant role in that very same process, right? And you're going to hear some of that a little bit today, because part of it is that we have lost sight of that particular kind of way in which the U.S. military, before the process of integration, was a regulatory, a disciplining, and in many ways an institution that sort of was analogous to forms of carcerality. And we have lost sight of that particular kind of history in relationship to World War I or World War II, and the archive, most notably the archive, right? It's an incredible archive in which you actually can hear black men and fewer black women actually uttering critiques, but also putting forward ideas about democracy, about a way of living, a way of existing in America and beyond. And so part of this is work in progress. In ein Fremdesland. Plot E, a largely unadorned gravesite in a US military cemetery located 2 hours north of Paris, might hauntingly be considered the ontological site of an emergent Afro-German experience, framed by World War II to the end of the Cold War. Here, US soldiers, allegedly rapists and murderers, the dishonorable dead, were dumped after being tried, convicted, stripped of their association with the US military, and then ceremoniously executed before a military formation and the assembled local population. If the guilty party was black, white officers conscripted 1 or 2 black soldiers from nearby all-black units, temporarily composing the rare interracial military battalion ordered into existence for the express purpose of witnessing. These spectacles of justice happened repeatedly throughout European villages, towns, and the occasional city where the alleged crimes had occurred. In Plot E, according to military records, lie 96 dead men. They are mostly black, like Louis Till, Emmett Till's father, executed for allegedly raping an Italian woman in the last months of the war. According to the French literary scholar Alice Kaplan, the US military conferred 443 death sentences as a result of court-martials in the European theater of operations, which included England, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Between 1943 and 1946, the US military carried out 70 executions for capital offenses, including rape, murder, and rape murder. Of the 70 executed, African Americans totaled 55. Stated differently, African Americans comprised 80%, or nearly 80% of the executed, at a time when black folks comprised 8% of the American soldiers in Europe. Justice and democracy on display? Clearly, the US military, as both liberators and conquerors, wanted to impress on the European civilian population that the rule of law would prevail in their victorious wake. And for this reason, the command structure staged elaborate military formations in the midst of an ongoing war and the sea of destruction that preceded and followed them in the immediate aftermath to focus on ceremony, pomp, and circumstances, but also confession, usually black confessions, before assembled troops and civilians. Military officers had learned a public relations lesson in the aftermath of World War I when the press, both white and black, investigated charges of white vigilante violence resulting in black lynchings in Europe alongside military discipline that did away with due process. The US Senate held extensive hearings and then released its findings, published as an alleged executions without trials in France. On the basis of the testimony of American combatants, the New York Times made a rare exception to the report on lynchings. Since they took place in France, those extra-legal executions were unusual and therefore news. For this reason, and to insist on their code of conduct, the honor code, alongside the desire to uphold the U.S. Constitution and its democratizing mission, the U.S. military couched the trials and executions in extensive formalities that still remained under-examined and under-theorized. I should note, even as I bring this prelude to a close, that neither the Black press, civil rights organizations, or fact-finding missions of the NAACP, Executive Director Walter White, or W.E.B. Du Bois questioned the formalities, raised concerns about due process, queried the statistics that in a military where blacks figured as a small minority, they allegedly counted overwhelmingly as the majority of rape murderers. After all, the convicted rapist murderers of European white folks were already buried. Parents and kinfolk back in North Carolina, Detroit, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama may have had questions, but the Army simply informed them in writing of a disgraced soldier's death. No details or explanations offered. German, Italian, Flemish, and French court interpreters, like Louis Giraud, along with villagers and anonymous individuals, did question the process, but their doubts and challenges could not keep pace with the trials or overcome mechanistic procedure and assumptions of black guilt. As the Black World War II veteran Frank Pennick recalled, quote, "Once my unit was mustered out to be looked over by an Italian woman for a rape charge. The practice was as soon as word of rape was mentioned, anywhere the first guys hauled out to be looked out were Negroes. And you know, during the war, rape is a hanging offense," end quote. I want to shift the focus away from Plot E, but also from the alleged battlefield justice and toward the well-worn and extensively discussed terrain of American occupation, the German-American encounter, and the period leading up to and from the return of German sovereignty. I'm here building on the foundation erected by Professor Hergert and his colleagues at Gutenberg Uni Mainz, and now more recently the remarkable, and I do mean remarkable, work of such feminist historians like Maria Hearn, Heidi Fehrenbach, Tina Grossman, our own Dagmar Herzog, and Carrie Polk. Collectively, this work of American studies, social history of the military, and German history models interdisciplinarity that speaks to transnationalism, the study of race and race relations, gender and the history of sexuality, but also gender politics as high politics. Obviously, one might ask what more could be said. Here I would suggest a lot more, given the monumental nature of the era, the scale of the 20th century, and the importance of that history beyond the story of the Nazis, occupation, and its immediate aftermath. I would also offer that there's a need for differing perspectives and interpretive stances in which distinctive subjects are centered. For instance, but not exclusively, more attention could be afforded to the experiences of black folk, black masculinity in particular, that is read beyond being merely pathological or craven. Done with skill and verve, it would also be a critical contribution to the study of transnationalism and articulations of white supremacy by helping us understand the growing ascendance of the global right or the southernization of authoritarian populism worldwide. This represents a deconstructive intervention that would trouble not only America and the story it tells, it reminds us of the exclusiveness, limits, and novelty of liberal political theory. It also questions the very idea of the singularity of American democracy. What do I mean? Democracy as an ideal and creed, but also as high politics and practice, was a key word in the post-war period, as it is at this very moment. It means similar and yet different things in our present and our various past, but also assume distinctive forms through the locus of enunciation, dem Sprecher, the speaker. By allowing for an American democracy, which Germans who at the time were being indoctrinated as liberal Western subjects questioned, often on the basis of how white Americans related to blacks, we cannot we cannot fully comprehend the sentiments nor the theorization of thousands of black working class men who, like the soldier Claude Ramsey, offered a critique of American democracy, elaborated on its very nature, and staked claims to democracy yet to be enacted. Quote, "Civilian life is one thing," exclaimed Ramsey, "but to be drafted to fight the world for democracy only to find that you have entered the most undemocratic and racist organization in the whole country is quite another thing," end quote. In reducing Ramsey's words or Ramsey's views to solely a race critique, or in the discursive sentiments of the time, what the Negro wants, we don't hear a reflection on the demos, or a critique of the institutions that allegedly upheld it and the democratic possibility. This is still, and it must be said, the white American story, and that of the global elite who relatively easily mimic white public opinion, Northern and Southern. Also, to see this as merely a lament of racial wounding, we reduce the criticism to the problem of blacks, a trivialization of black demands, that also does not see a rights discourse expressed by blacks as being fundamentally about the problem of and the unfinished nature of American democracy. In the normative discourse from the founding fathers to the instrumentalist on today's Supreme Court, black critique is always about something other than politics, race, but fundamentally not about the demos. Black existentialism was never only ever forged from an idealist tradition or its relation to the demos, and democracy continues to demand a relation to demos, and democracy continues to demand a recognition of the historical reality. But even the brilliant political theorist Hannah Arendt could not imagine that either the experience of the enslaved or subsequently the civil rights movement being more than a social question, right? The question of race was not a political question. As the literary theorist Saidiya Hartman has written in Scenes of Subjection by way of a critique of Arendt, quote, "My definition of the social differs from Arendt in major aspects or respects. She, Arendt, bemoans the introduction of the social into the sphere of the political because she considers needs pre-political and instinctual, and condemns the introduction of the bodily into the space of reason and contemplation. For Arendt, the social denotes the violent intrusion of the bodily into the political domain. The social engulfs the political with concerns that properly belong in the sphere of the household," end quote. Shortly, and when I return briefly to Afro-Germans, I will come back to the household frame as belonging to the domain of the social. Here, I simply want to note that in the midst of fighting a war for democracy, FDR, the President and Commander-in-Chief, offhandedly reduced black demands to a dangerous social experiment, mimicking white Southern claims that blacks aspired to social equality, a trope for miscegenation. By setting aside liberal elite and white supremacist assumptions, we approach a framework for thinking with the thoughts, words, and practices of black GIs as being political and about politics in the post-war period, in a manner that shifts race from being the special provenance of blacks and blackness, while also being about democracy, not just morality, social equality, or identity. As we acknowledge the existence of one of the largest archives of black political practice and thought, we have to refuse our habits of not wanting to hear blacks having actual thoughts or merely hearing black utterances as laments calling for respect and respectability, along with a desire to be of a white woman. To do so is a reductive act that limits the modern black political horizon to social equality, which in the post-Civil War white imaginary was always already focused on black men having sex with white women. Panics over racial taboos have often distorted legibility of black political demands, but even more than that, have obscured an archival presence that represents social existence as standing in for so much more. As the literary theorist David Kazanjian has written about 19th century African-American immigrants to Liberia, whose archive is similarly under-examined and under-theorized, quote, "Rather than interpreting these quotidian combinations of generic convention and situated particularity as mere repositories of empirical detail, or as representations of authorial self-possession, or as windows into private feeling," states Kazanjian, "I find it in their too easily overlooked pores heterodox performances of the very meaning of freedom. That is, I call deeply theoretical and highly speculative thought from an apparently mundane salutation. Here, Kazanjian reflects on the epistolary archive that 19th century Black Americans addressed and composed to their former masters, who still held family and kin in bondage. As they sent word to their kinfolk about their trials and tribulations in Liberia, they also requested supplies, technologies, and Bibles. Kazanjian skillfully discerns both a critique and an expounded framing of freedom, offering us strategies for reading these letters, but also the political sentiments of Black GIs in a new light. Building on the aforementioned, let us revisit the terrain of Black GIs in post-war Germany in hopes of approaching a critical facet of the Afro-German experience. In the section that follows, I want to draw attention to a key word of the period: economy, or the economy. In doing so, I want to suggest that while the dollar economy, Americanization, commercialization, Schwarzmarkt, the black market, die Deutschmarkt, the German market, die Wirtschaft, the economy, and die Wirtschaftswunder, that's the economic miracle, were widely in circulation through the post-war period and beyond. The Black American stress on the economy took on a slightly different valence, linked to a politics, a universality, or a rendering of democracy, but also Black autonomy and Black patriarchal authority, which would influence the formation of Afro-Germans linked to the American presence. I draw on two passages to hopefully illustrate the case. One from William Gardner Smith's 1948 novel, Last of the Conquerors, which Tyler Schmidt brought to my attention years ago. Thank you. Which drew on his and other Black GIs' war and post-war experiences. That's William Smith, not Tyler's, right? The other from a municipal, commercial, and civic guide, Westphal's Information Services and Business Directory. Living on the economy, the authors of Westphal's write, can be a rewarding experience if you try to fit in, if you learn about local customs and comply with their practices. Your stay can be a memorable one for the whole family, and will help foster good American relations as well. In the passage from Smith, we find the Black protagonist, Hayes Dawkins, fantasizing about living on the economy with his German partner, Ilse. A house in Wannsee, Berlin, with ivy on the walls and a flower garden with lawn chairs. A small house, but a house that is clean, to which many friends can come to talk and play cards and drink beer and maybe schnapps, with books along the walls and scrubbed, painted, but with books along the walls and scrubbed paint and windows that open out, and a bathtub that is always well washed and always being used. A porch, a nighttime sitting on the porch, looking out at the water in Wannsee, hearing the wind through the trees, smelling the scent of the grass and trees and waters and flowers, with quiet in the night and rising early in the morning, and the wife who puts the blankets and sheets and pillows in the windows at 8 o'clock to air out, paintings on the wall, listening to operas, symphonies over the radio, or in the theater, head held high and smiling people, end quote. There's a lot that cannot be explored here, and I should note that Werner Sarlaus in The Temptation of Despair, Heidi Fehrenbach in Race After Hitler, Adam Schatz of the New Yorker magazine, and Carrie Polk in Contagions of Empire have offered compelling readings of Smith's novel, The Last Conqueror. Still, I want to think with these idealist passages about the economy, what these idealist passages might have symbolized for the Black American or for the Black male, but at once it suggests it representing something different for the Afro-German offspring. In other words, the economy was a geographic site where the Black and Afro-German experience was actualized and in a state of articulation beyond now iconic characterizations of the American-German Black-white encounter. Here is where families formed. Fathers were present, usually. German and English were in dialogue, where offspring, Afro-Germans attended local schools, played with neighborhood kids, participated in civic life, swimming in pools, joined choirs, played sports of the village, towns, and cities. In a certain sense, in a certain sense, I'm trying to circumvent that Fanonian refrain that still stands in for the European black encounter. Look, Mom, a Negro. What this phenomenological moment does not attend to is a perspective that centers the Negro who was quickly surrounded by a companion, a lover, a man, a woman, a wife, and others, allowing him to exhibit a range of emotions, intimacies, affirmation, anger, love, and pain. His offspring, the Afropean, the Afro-German, would not be experiencing that singular encounter or exceptional moment, but would suffer less traumatic instances and process them through the very same language, cultural cues, and symbolic framework of those expressing surprise. Gokmuti, Ainega. But what is more, the Afro-German would also embody all the assumptions that surround the black male's encounter with the larger world, which, despite its complicity, always gets reduced to the white woman's relationship to him. Where are you from? Which is then quickly followed by, was your father in the military? What is left unsaid, but is assumed, but is far more than an effort to situate the unfamiliar presence. It actually involved assumptions about the nature of the relationship that engendered the self. In other words, was your father in the military carries with it the idea that your mother was a war bride, and even long after the war, a trophy of the military presence, like a Bierstein or a Hummel figure. To come back explicitly to the economy, as expressed in Smith's passage, the economy is not a site of segregation, but of self-selected isolation, difference, yet normality, the place of the Black American, but also the interracial family quotidian or Alltag, a site that needs to be theorized around the black male presence in dialogue with what German life meant at the experiential level. We can, of course, read this as being petty bourgeois or kleinbürgerlich, and it was. But when history, experience, and knowing tells you that property, the sanctity of home, and one's body are never secured by dominion or Herrschaft over one's possession and kin, and then not sanctioned by state power, petty bourgeois takes on a different meaning in a liberal order. Smith's version of this is mine, it's pretty and clean, takes on a particular valence. For Smith, but also those thousands of black working men who are still in Germany and figure prominently in my larger historical ethnography, economy is a way of reimagining democracy. Let us listen to one of Smith's characters. The professor made clear to a black compatriot why he's toying with the idea of staying in Germany. You know what? I don't think I'll ever be happy at home again. I was born there, and my parents were born there. I'll go back because it's the only place I know. But, you know, before I came here, I just ignored things that went on there. I mean, I knew what was going on. I wrote about it, in fact, and I hated it. But I was used to it. Now it's different. I've gotten away from that stuff, and I'll never take it again calmly. It'll endure, I guess, but I might even become sort of used to it, but not the way it was before. I'll never take it the way I used to, because I'll always remember the irony of me going to Germany to find democracy, end quote. I want to be clear that economy, a term widely circulating among Americans in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, moves matters to subsequent levels of the encounter, and in some ways offered a reprieve from the antagonism of the occupation in the immediate post-war period. With a break in regimentation, black soldiers were able to establish some autonomy, if not independence. They acted on their desire, and as individuals formed relationships and then families. A space and a moment when individuals and families confronted life and attitudes beyond the narrow 24/7 of being GIs and under military authority. There is, in short, a shift to leisure and family encounters with neighbors, and the larger community inhabited by children, mothers, kinfolk, and neighbors. Here, Attitudes, perceptions, stereotypes, curiosity born of race, difference, and local morality came into play, but conflict and antagonism is processed through a decidedly different register. Much of this took place in and through the discourse of economy. The economy represented civilian places to eat and drink, a site of recreation, as in leisure, but also reproduction, the orbit in which the household was established where masculine gender prerogatives and parental authority were enacted. Here was the modern oikos, presided over by a black patrician, still a novelty in much of black life in the mid-20th century. Yes, a novelty. Let us recall that in the 19th century, Daniel Delaney, Maryland's Attorney General, observed that the law recognized no marriage relationship between slaves. According to Delaney, a slave never has maintained an action against the violator of his bed, nor is admonished for incontinence, or punished for fornication or adultery, never prosecuted for bigamy or petty treason. End quote. Here, the Attorney General was simply affirming Maryland's statutory law. Here's, it's Herman Bennett. Here, the Attorney General was simply affirming Maryland's statutory law, which merely resembled the statutes or common law of most states in the Union, that is, the United States. What this would mean as black life emerged from both the slave condition and the denial of black citizenship is rather simple. As an American legal phenomenon, the black family only came into existence in 1866. The historian Tara Hunter has brilliantly illustrated in Bound in Wedlock, Slave and Free Black Marriages in the 19th Century, that despite our ancient past in America, 1619, it wasn't until 1866 that a black couple in her family line secured state support for its conjugal union. There were marriages, of course, in her family tree, which he reconstructed back to the early 18th century, but there was also the repeated presence of white forefathers, slavers, who engendered her, and by implication, the black family, despite the existence of free blacks in the genealogy as early as the 18th century and throughout the 19th century. Despite a long-standing black past, the legally sanctioned heteronormative black family, that is one with a black man present, is a relatively novel phenomenon for most black people. Quote, while historians have viewed the repression of black marriage as primarily a sign of degradation, end quote, Hunter concludes that the control over black sexuality and access to marriage meant much more. She shows, for example, U.S. congressmen in the midst of the Civil War, while debating the passage of the Militia Act of 1862, a law about enlisting and arming runaways, contraband, or black men who fled to Union lines, queried again and again, does the slave have a wife? In other words, does the slave have an effective life that has civil standing? Here then we see that by accepting the enslaved as soldiers, there would be implications for those who they claimed as wives and their dependents. And yet, notes the Hunter, surprisingly little has been written about the relationship despite attention to nearly every other aspect of their experiences, including political activism, labor, property, ownership, housing, education, and religion. I want to linger a bit on the phrase, surprisingly little has been written about their relationship, yet moving forward in time and shifting the locale back to post-war Germany. As Germany recovered its sovereignty in 1955, a steady stream of black German couples availed themselves of the rights enshrined in the Basic Law, Germany's constitution, that formally superseded the 1935 Nuremberg laws, laws which, among other things, defined, prohibited, and criminalized both interracial sex and marriage. Confronted by countless humiliations at the hands of American military and German civilian authorities, but also laws that banned and criminalized interracial marriage in 35 out of 52 American states, thousands, and I literally mean thousands, of black soldiers and German Fräuleins walked into the Standesamt, that is the civil registry, in rural, suburban, and urban settings throughout Germany to secure state recognitions of their marriages. Let me state this differently. 15 years after the Nazis' defeat, democratic aspirations and practice were being enacted throughout West German villages, towns, and cities. Prominent Nazis had been removed from public life, and a few years later, Allied military occupation gave way to civilian rule and to the return of German sovereignty with the implementation of basic law, or das Grundgesetz. In the context of these political developments, signifying Germany's re-embracing of liberal democratic values, thousands of intercultural but also interracial couples were married throughout Germany. Now, and that is literally 55, 56, 57, 58. Now, within a generation of the Nazis' defeat, black men and white German women were regularly marrying in Germany when 10 years earlier such unions were outlawed and criminalized, which they would be in much of the United States until the Supreme Court in 1967 finally overturned statutory laws banning interracial marriages with its decision in Loving versus Virginia. As part of democratization, basic law was unfurled with a flurry and widely disseminated. Consequently, when German women and men wished to marry, the law and the state protected their choices. Still, we must ask, how did black GIs and their German girlfriends come to avail themselves of these new rights soon, if not almost immediately, after being promulgated? This strategic awareness, knowing which office to turn to, which laws to invoke and to utilize, the principle of universality enshrined in the basic laws, underscores continuities in modern life, but also hints at an acute legal consciousness. It also positions these black German couples as the vanguard of interracial unions, that is, as everyday civil rights activists who utilized the newly established rights in German sovereignty to effect change in the American social and legal landscape, regardless if they stayed in Germany indefinitely. I want to be mindful not to minimize the risks at stake and the danger involved. In the moral panic that the conqueror's presence unleashed, black-white sex was always supercharged, positioning such encounters as rapists and whores, the proverbial John und das Negerflittchen. Indeed, the vice raids and the procurement trials that I've been investigating in city and state archives throughout the state of Hessen in the 1960s and 70s shows that when it came to black-white encounters and unions, civil rights were frequently bypassed under the official pretext of curtailing illicit sex. Allegations of the illicit and the illegitimacy and illegitimate would then be the foundational specter in and through which post-war Afro-Germans would emerge. Let me just say that again. To be Afro-German in the post-war period was by definition transgressive, illicit, and illegitimate in terms of discursive registers, right? The public discursive registers. In closing, I want to note that this is a world that is now lost to us, or is increasingly we're losing touch with it, and steadily being rendered deeper into the recesses of the past, in part because of its origin in movement, militarism, and masculinity. In part because of the other monumental events, but also because it has been reduced to a spectral presence rather than being rendered meaningful or significant in terms of domesticity, neighborhoods, villages, towns, and cities, and the illicit spaces that grew up and around the informal economy, black markets that emerge in the interstitial sites that emerged out of need, surplus, and yearning. Thank you. So we should just go and just start drinking wine. You can just send me your questions and I'll answer them online. Thank you for being here, Uday. Yeah, but yeah, sure. Candace will do that for us. Thank you. Okay, good. All right, thank you.
Professor Bennett is happy to take some questions. Actually, he really wants a glass of wine while he takes questions.
Yeah.
Please, Van, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting.
For the streaming, I'm going to give you this.
Oh, good.
I have no idea what's being streamed now. Thank you so much. It's amazing to listen to this unusual piece of history being uncovered. I guess I have two questions. The first, coming back to plot 5 where you started, I wondered if the black men that you described were persecuted by the military or by German government, because the distinction is important to me. On the one hand is the militarization and the Castro nature of the U.S. military, whereas the other kind of part of that would be, how the post-war government in Germany treated potential criminals or alleged criminality of black men in the German soil. And then my broader question is about the transnational political ideals and aspirations for democracy. How much do you think does the advance that you describe in post-war Germany in terms of interracial inclusion inspire and inform the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s, which is a decade later than the inclusion we saw in Europe?
Thank you, Vincent. That's a great question, and I appreciate the layered nature of it. And so I'm going to start at the bottom and at the end and work my way towards the front. I would say that I think that's an we haven't really attended to that part of the story. Those people, can you hear me better like this? Away? There you go. I don't have the familiarity. I'm like on the Zoom screen. And so one of the things, thank you, Jennifer. So one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind is that there's a body of work that sort of talks about the impact that the returning soldiers have on the civil rights movement. That's the work of like Tim Tyson, among others, right? And that body of work is really rich. But one of the things that they focus on is their focus is on like respect on the part of these black men. But what we also have to keep in mind is that these black men aren't just coming back as soldiers, right? Because what happens if we sort of reduce them to, or we confine them to just being soldiers as opposed to seeing them as part of families and being part of a domestic unit, right? Then immediately we're moving out, it then becomes a kind of male story, right? So the civil rights movement then it looks the way that we kind of are familiar with it, right? It's like the ministers of the SCLC and so on, right? Rather than thinking about this as being a relationship, something that comes out of domestic politics, right? So that you can have someone like Fannie Lou Hamer and her husband, and then they have to make a decision, where he came out of the military, but she was the one who was the activist, right? And so I'm interested in thinking about these men who come back. Those who do come back are oftentimes men who aren't married to German women in the first instance in the South. They wind up there are very few states that they can go to. And where they do go to are northern states or really far west, Pacific Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest. And I think that they do play a significant role, right? Because that very presence sets patterns. It sets patterns it sets precedents. And I think that if once we go back and sort of think doing that kind of transnational work, we'll actually see that these relationships, that these become some of the key individual cases that folks will utilize to build up a history that leads up to Loving versus Virginia, right? But we haven't done that kind of work yet. We haven't even asked that work because part of the whole taboo around black-white sexuality, right? I mean, because it's like, that's not the story that the civil rights movement wanted to lead with. It's just, it was because the idea was that somehow civil rights was just simply there to feed, social equality, which was something about like interracial sex, as opposed to thinking about it as a political framing. And to the previous parts of the question, the Germans actually have a lot of they do make a difference between black GIs and white GIs, right? After 55, the black GI with a German woman is still a predator, right? and is legal, and the woman that he's identified with can be, as Maria Hearn and others have pointed out, they can be stopped and questioned as prostitutes. When her sister with the white GI is just basically seen as a couple after 55, right? And so we can see the arrest pattern. Yeah, those arrest patterns, and so part of, and for those of you who don't know so much of that history, because that stuff is pretty well established, basically the U.S. military reestablishes segregation not the military itself, but the soldiers themselves reestablished the patterns, the familiar patterns of the South in the United States, in the United States of Germany, right? And I think that's really important. There are black bars, white bars. It's like the music scene, and that also includes the partitioning of women, right? Families are split based on if someone's dating a white GI versus a black GI, and then also the vice raids continue of like black party spaces and leisure spaces well into that. So.
Thank you, Professor Bennett, for the presentation. I have two questions which actually are quite connected to the first person who, I don't know, but already posed the question. The first is what you were just mentioning, is like how can we understand the very conceptualization of race and racial formations from this exposition you were making, because we can clearly see there is like how are connected like the notion of race in the 1940s United States and the post-war Germany that kind of overlap in the very experience of these black soldiers. So what happens when we mix these two experiences and we ask ourselves, like, how can we understand the very concept of race and like what happens there? And the second question is also about the transnational view of this, because I think it's very interesting. Like the case you choose to make this exposition allows us to see not just the movement of people, but also of ideas and also of all kind of social constructions related to that. So I found it very interesting how you were mentioning, I didn't know that before, that how it was possible for these white women and black men to marry in Germany, but not in the United States, right? So how was that seen in the United States? Like, how were politicians in the North and South saying, like, look what is happening in Germany. We have black people marrying white women when this is not possible here. But I also wonder about the experience of Afro-Germans and like how they saw these black American soldiers marrying white women and be able to do that. Like, how do you connect the experience of Afro-Germans, let's say, not from the U.S. origin with this from the U.S. origin?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a tough question, right? Because that population is in some ways is deeply marginalized and traumatized, right, by the war. Is traumatized by its experience, in the sense of it's a completely isolated population. And some of them wind up in camps, some wind up in camps, and some are actually just straight up Germans who are experiencing a lot of trauma, even as they're in the Hitler Youth or in the German army, right? We know that many of those that were come of age, of that group that you're talking about, that came of age at point of puberty, were either castrated or sterilized, right? That was just a standard practice. And so the question then of identification becomes very complicated, because the narrative is that we haven't really sort of asked that kind of question yet, because what we know is that in this question of economy, the GIs, black GIs, are known for their familiarity and their friendliness and their kindness towards children. Right? It's remarked on. It's like a trope within the literary form, various literary forms. Everyone's talking about it, right? That the black GI is willing to share his candy, his sea rations, and everything. And white GIs are seen as much more sort of standoffish in the first instance, right? And it's probably not true, but there is something about that we need to think about. So I do think that there is a way in which this kind of like kinfolk, or this embracing of kinfolk, because there is talk about, in some of this, in this literature, but you also see it in the newspapers. There are black kids, and people are like, sort of like pulling the little boy aside, the little girl aside, and sort of taking them to the base and to get them cleaned up, right? So there's some attention to that, but right now it's just all anecdotal. So I don't really know how to make sense of that, but there are enough examples of that clearly there's some connection. The question is, what would their perception be, right? And that's a hard thing to get at, because people weren't really interested in their perceptions in that period, because it would be either of the military guys or of what the Germans, the white Germans were thinking, right? In terms of the question of race, I mean, I think that this story is really complicated, and partly what I'm here giving you guys context, but one of the things I began to understand in this Afro-German narrative is that much of the kind of German anti-Semitism, the language of German anti-Semitism, is very quickly sublimated and projected onto the Afro-German population. Just the very basic concept of mixie-kit. Right? That comes out of the Nuremberg law. That's what preceded, that comes out of the Nuremberg laws and that language of the Nazis, right? Because partly what German Jewish kids were called mixies, right? Mischlingkinder. And that language then is projected specifically on black German, not American, not white American and German relations. And so there's a way in which there's a grammar that comes from the kind of German anti-Semitism that is then imposed onto the Afro-German population, as well as those relationships, right? And we haven't really done that kind of work, in part, and we haven't done a lot of work on that yet, but what's interesting is that there's also a way in which German anti-Semitism also, as Tina Grossman and others have talked about, becomes increasingly not seen as a racial discourse. It becomes seen as an anti-Semitic and is held in that space, as opposed to seen as a racial discourse. And so that therefore we lose sight of the fact that, it is first and foremost a racist discourse that is through the modality of anti-Semitism, right? And partly there's a reason why that happens in the 1950s, in the 50s and 60s, and I think that's really important for us to sort of keep that in mind as we sort of move forward in this kind of work. So I hope that answers your question. And I will just say, the Afro-Americans were like shocked when in the South, when they were completely shocked when they looked at the fact that there were 500,000 German prisoners in the South who could actually at any one moment leave the prison camp, go to a restaurant, go to a bar whenever it was time to have dinner or drinks. And yet all those Afro-Americans who were guarding them, who were escorting them, who were their security detail, could not actually enter into the actual restaurant. They had to escort them there, and then they had to wait while they were able to eat, drink, party, sleep with Southern whites.
I guess I'll be quick, Herman. That was really amazing, and thank you for that. But I did have two questions that I'll just try to get out quickly. One, I mean, I wonder if you've thought about yet or will be thinking about the different relationship between Germany and blackness and, say, England and blackness and Spain and blackness or France and blackness, right? Given that kind of different, the kind of lack of involvement, or I shouldn't say the lack of involvement, but the different degree of involvement in the Black Atlantic history, right? And so is there a way in which, there's a kind of later 19th century relationship in Germany with blackness that actually spikes in the 20th century in relationship to a kind of Afro-American presence in a way that's quite different from, say, occupied parts of Italy even, right? So that's one question. And the other question is, in terms of thinking about economy, the ways in which these African-American GIs have a disposable income in Germany that puts them in a kind of different class position probably than most working class African-Americans in the United States, right? So how the ways in which, I mean, all of those things that develop, as we both know, develop around US military bases, right? That are, the signs for spend your paycheck the second you can leave the base, right? the ways in which those African-American soldiers are in a kind of slightly different position than factory workers, say, or agricultural workers in the
Yeah,
South.
no, that's great. No, that's exactly right. And I would say that you're right on the mark. And that's one of the reasons why I'm dealing with, I'm using that language of the economy in this talk, right? Because these are the same, this is the brother who actually just got through the boards that allowed him to be into the military, right? Keep in mind, Afro-Americans, there was a lot of resistance to actually arming these, not only arming, but actually recruiting these black guys into the military, right? Something like 50% of the Afro-Americans who tried to get into the military were rejected, right? They were patriots who were trying to join, but the military board, because, and in the South, there was a lot of resistance to it. And in fact, if you read like Howard Odom's like Rumors of War, the idea was that basically, the militarization of Afro-Americans would lead to a race war. And there was all this stuff, and the same moment that these executions happen, there are actually massive amounts of race riots that are happening on the part of white vigilantes going to camps, literally to the military camps, and sort of saying like, no, no, you can't leave camp. What are you doing here? Why are they armed? And completely overriding federal law, right? And so there's a kind of hostility there that is just completely lost to us. Right? And you can see it around like the Detroit riots, among other things, where they basically, the federal government in relationship with Southern law enforcement puts almost every military camp in which black troops are, and they're all black troops, they put them under martial law, right? Just period, because the threat. And so, but the point is that economy becomes one of the ways to think about that, because these are working class guys who are for the first time also experiencing leisure, right? So it's not as these are like middle class guys who are like more educated, had more Sunday school classes, therefore went on to university, whatever. These are individuals who were fortunate enough to be able to act under patriotism, to be taken up by those issues, and then wound up getting paid. Still getting paid less than the white soldier, by the way, and we're oftentimes not given an arm, not given a weapon, right? They're marching around with broomsticks for the most part, and until they're into the battle zone. And most of them are also, they're all in the quartermaster. 80% of these guys are truck drivers and the quartermaster staff. They're the people picking up the bodies, right? Only having to fight. And because the whole discourse in the U.S. military and in the country is that black men aren't masculine enough and aren't smart enough to fight, right? So these guys then are really under a lot of siege, and so then the economy becomes a place around which they can enact that. And I think and so I think that's really a good thing to work out, and what I'm trying to work out here. But the other thing is, what you were saying, I think that's exactly right. I'm trying to push away from the kind of thinking which has been very effective for the last 30 years, where we're sort of thinking about Black British, Black Atlantic, Afro-American, Black European presence. And there's so much more that has to be thought in relationship to Germany that has a different relationship to colonies and has a different relationship to Africa, right? It actually has colonies, but it also has a deep, long history with an African presence, but it's just isolated from the Middle Ages onwards, right? So you don't find it like in the way that you find Paris, Dakar. But what you do find is, the individual household servant or enslaved person who happens to be in Aachen or in a household in Köln. And once we start doing that kind of thinking the way that we're doing in the context of slavery in the North right now, the contemporary, we might see that there's actually a lot more of a black presence there, right? And that black presence is, in the first instance, African, and the Afro-American is in some ways a detour that kind of has overshadowed this other African past that now is actually, once again, much more prominent. There are 300,000 Africans that enter into Europe every year, of which 30,000 die, right? So that's telling you something. if we just keep 300,000 Africans enter into Europe every year, of which 30,000 die. That's no different than, that experience is like what's happening in the United States. More Africans and people of African descent have entered into the United States since 1965 than did during the entire history of the slave trade, right? So that there's a whole nother kind of way of thinking about racial formation in Europe and in the United States at this very moment, precisely because of those numbers.
Just as a footnote, when you were talking about African Germans versus African Americans, it's the same thing in Italy.
Yeah.
You've got African Italians who are really, what can we say, of second-class citizenry, to the point where even if you're born in Italy and raised in Italy, you're still not a citizen. You have to go through all sorts of bureaucratic hassles, basically, at the age of 18 if you want to stay, and if you want to become an Italian citizen. But it's the same. There's a type of quote-unquote privileging of the African American versus the African Italian.
Yeah.
And a lot of them come through Lampedusa.
Yeah.
There's 300,000. A lot of them are coming through Lampedusa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually a really rich field right there. I mean, having this and thinking about this in relationship to various other parts of Europe. So I'll take one more question, because I really want people to eat some of the food and have some wine. You can always talk to me,
Especially students, grad students.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take both of those student questions.
Yeah, why don't we take both of the questions?
You wanna go
and then,
first?
Herman can just respond
Right.
how he'd like.
We can keep talking, and you guys know, get in touch with me, please.
So mine is more of a methodological question. I know you're colonial originally, so how is it different to do colonial versus a more modern kind of history?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you, Kathy. Wow, it's overwhelming how much, the abundance of material. I mean, you just walk into an archive and you're just like, you just grab something and you're just like, oh my God, it's like so abundant. And, so it's stunning how much work, and it requires somebody like me, an old fogey like me, to really think about, I need other kinds of tools about how to process, how to make an archive, how to go into an archive, to take that work out and to process it, to figure out how to distill it into something useful to me, but that also then can be represented in ways. So those are really complicated questions, because in the 16th century, it was like, those of us who work in that early period, sometimes you're just looking at a document and you just have to turn it upside down just to be like, okay, now, that's, that was 2 days worth of work. Right? It's just a whole different ballgame. Scale.
Just very quickly, but to sort of map out the intellectual history of white supremacy, right? Like what you said about sort of the Nazi project, that it's kind of just thought about as anti-Semitic, but it was actually a racist project at the beginning. And so how fitting that project was for the Southern project that was then mapped onto Germany after the Second World War, and then mapping it up until the present moment, right? In which, as we've seen for the past 10 years more explicitly, all the neo-Nazi ideology is mapped out into the Deep South sort of Make America Great Again discourse. So I wonder what your comment is about that, because the relevance of your work into focusing on the post-war period of the Greatest Generation is obviously making a big critique about that generation, and then how you see the intellectual history of white supremacy mapping up until today.
Yeah, no, Carlos, thank you for that question. And I'm not going to be able to do real service to that question, because that requires, just sort of sitting down and really unpacking that. But I do see sort of common cause and common cause there, because I think that there's a way in which, and partly the narrative of America needed because of the Cold War, is that we just sort of thought about getting rid of, Hitler and Eichmann and all these other people was enough. But part of But part of what happened is that there's a tradition of German conservatism, right, that just continued on. The dentist, the lawyer, the doctor, and those were individuals who continued on in terms of a tradition of German conservatism that kind of has made its way into that continues to make its way into, into Europe and the deep right. And you sort of see like the Deutsche Alternative, just that kind of anti-immigration narrative and the ways in which who belongs and who doesn't belong. Those kinds of discourses are just deep and there. And they don't necessarily need Nazis, right? That's the thing, right? There's a way in which, and Duncan, who spends a lot of time thinking about these kinds of issues and writing and having a deep kind of political critique around this stuff, has talked about how, that there are these massive amounts of normalization of the right. And they have found common cause with the American right, and they have found common cause with the Hungarian right. So there's a way in which that these kind of conservatives have drawn, they've disassociated themselves with the worst aspects of of the certain kinds of Nazist past or certain kinds of forms of white supremacy, but they've taken certain grammars of that and they share that in common, right? There's a way in which they speak across the divide. They are actually uniting the Atlantic in some really fascinating ways. And we are still trying to make sense of that. And if we're looking for, the skinheads as the problem, we're missing the fact that they're actually in the Kanzlerei. They're actually in offices. They're normal. They're burghers, right? They're good citizens. And we know that from our own experiences, not just here in the United States, but in Latin America and throughout other parts of Europe. I just want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to thank you guys, and just keep in mind.
I took the mic back so I could say, interrupt Professor Bennett to say, please join me in thanking Professor Bennett for his lecture, and then also in allowing IRDOC to be this incredibly hospitable space for us intellectually as well as socially. Both to Z and Herman, thank you for that.